So I think another one that's going to raise its head above the parapet over the course of the next couple of months is macro-prudential restrictions. And it's a very unsexy topic. It's hard to explain, but since the GFC, we have seen ASIC and APRA continually increase restrictions on banks lending, particularly to first home buyers. And as a consequence of that, they have an ever desire to get a lower and lower level of mortgage delinquency. And the closer we get to zero, the higher the price of those restrictions are on first home buyers, because first home buyers, of course, are inherently the riskiest borrower. Investors usually have other assets and other forms of incomes. Banks are able to lend to those people with deep pockets. And what we've seen is it is now very expensive for banks to lend to first home buyers. We see 5% mortgages have been forced out of the market. Increasingly, anyone with less than a 10% deposit is being forced out of the market. And it's significantly more expensive now for banks to lend to somebody who had a 10% deposit compared to what it was 20 years ago. And so that has compounded the equity problem, making it, whilst in a lot of senses it's easier to service a mortgage today than it was 20 years ago, it is much harder to get that mortgage in the first place. And we've arrived at a scenario where it's probably time that we needed to look at a Reserve Bank style governance arrangement for ASIC and APRA. We probably need an independent board, and to set them a goal of mortgage delinquencies being between 2 and 3%, not unlike what we do with the Reserve Bank, accepting that inevitably some households will find themselves suddenly unemployed and unable to service their mortgage. But that in itself is not what government's role is. Government shouldn't be stopping banks lending to people that may find themselves unemployed. Their role is to ensure that the financial services sector is stable and reliable. And we have an extraordinarily low level of mortgage delinquency. Even if a household does default, if they're on a rising housing market and they're able to sell on that market, and that we don't enter into that financial contagion environment that we saw in the United States. And 4% unemployment, 3% interest rate buffer applied to lending at the moment. It is the the UK removed that 3% buffer 2 years ago. It's still in place in Australia.
Yeah, Tim, I've been sort of arguing this point also around the Council of Financial Regulators, which consists of Treasury, APRA, and obviously the RBA, in respect to, we can understand that I think they believe it's inflationary. It's going to add to that sort of demand pool, and they don't necessarily want more investors in the market at the moment. But
that's a really important topic, because it's not inflationary. Just because somebody is going from renting a house to buying a house, that does not create demand for housing. Allowing someone to get a loan is not creating demand. It does not change the number of homes in the market, and it does not change the population. They're the two dynamics that determine supply and demand.
Tim, I'm so glad you raised that, because we've been advocating that all of the time. But that's ultimately what they're thinking, that it is inflationary more broadly. Now, whether that's wealth effect for property prices going higher, but the reality is that we need this supply, and it's ridiculous to think if you've got interest rates at sort of say 6.5%, you've got a 3% buffer rate, that they're doing servicing calculations at 9.5%. I promise you that 25% of the population would fail on their mortgage if interest rates went to that height. And so it's impossible for them to get there, because the economy would collapse not only into a recession, but into a significantly deeper recession, which would ultimately then require a stimulus opportunity where the cash rate would go lower. So that makes absolutely no sense to me at all, that we're not sort of moving the dial on that. So I will continue to advocate and put pressure there also, in terms of, you want this supply story. Like, you're telling everyone's on the same boat, saying it's a supply problem. It's a supply problem. But ultimately, we're seeing none of the government making the tough decisions that instigate serious reforms in areas that we need them, and to reduce those costs.